Hi, I'm Ashton, and a fun fact about me is that I should be packing right now because I go back to school tomorrow, but my favorite way to procrastinate is doing something productive instead of doing what I actually need to be doing that's also productive. So instead of packing right now, I'm going to talk to you and sew a patch on my jacket. Welcome to Patches and Parley. I guarantee you, like, at least half of my videos are filmed while I'm procrastinating doing something more important than filming a video. So I'm sewing on a patch that is completely unrelated to this topic, but I wanted to talk about trigger warnings, particularly because I feel like people don't actually know what trigger warnings are and how to effectively use them. As someone who is genuinely, like, helped, and as someone whose mental health is, like, genuinely better when trigger warnings are provided, I would like to give some perspective on why they're helpful, how a lot of people actually use them, and some common myths that are around the idea of trigger warnings. If you're new, Patches and Parley is a series on this channel where I sew something, or make something, or just do something generally creative with usually one of my denim jackets, and talk about something usually political or queer related. This is kind of tangential to being queer, at least for me, and I guess political because a lot of, specifically right-wing people are like, trigger warnings for sensitive fucking snowflakes, and yeah, shut up. So first off, what is a trigger warning and how do you effectively use one or implement one? When you are creating media that could potentially include something triggering, media could be a film, it could be a TV show, it could be a YouTube video, it could be a book, it could be a poem, it could be a speech, it could be a public presentation. Anything that you are creating, anything that you are helping create, those things can and I believe should include trigger warnings if they include sensitive topics. Now, when I say sensitive topics, I don't mean, ooh, my play's gonna talk about politics, sensitive. No, if your piece of media includes something like discussion of sexual assault, a rape scene, domestic abuse, violence, intense bigotry, those things are things that should have trigger warnings attached to them. Some people will also word it as a content note or a content warning. So if you see TW or CW or CN, oftentimes that means content note, content warning, or trigger warning. And the majority of the time when people put content warnings or trigger warnings on things, they do it the right way. But a lot of the times people don't. In social media posts especially, before, I've seen people just be like, trigger warning, and then continue the tweet. If you just say trigger warning without saying what that trigger is, or telling your audience what will be discussed, it becomes useless. For example, for me, one note that is very helpful is discussion of disordered eating and eating disorders. So if someone I'm following on Twitter has a tweet that goes, trigger warning, then talks about an eating disorder, I'm not gonna know from them just saying trigger warning that it's something I should be careful about. They have to say trigger warning, disordered eating, or trigger warning, eating disorder, or whatever way phrasing makes sense for them. If you just say trigger warning, it doesn't help anybody because we don't know what the heck you're talking about. A warning could be, dozens and dozens of different things. So if you just don't specify and you just say content warning, then it doesn't really mean anything because we don't know what we're going to see. We don't know what content we are being warned about. It's like with movie ratings, right? Those are essentially content notes, content warnings. They're rated on a certain system, and then they have little notes on the side that tell you what it is that makes it have that rating. Like if your kids are going to a PG-13 movie and you don't care if they see something that has cursing in it, but you don't want them to see graphic violence or cartoon violence or however that rating system works, you would look at the little label and be like, oh, this one has violence in it, let's go see this one instead. So content notes such as the way that we rate movies don't just exist like independently. You can't just say, hey, content warning, and then talk about something super sensitive because you didn't actually give a content warning. You just said content warning or trigger warning. You didn't say what it was for. That's not gonna help anybody. I feel like that's the most common way I see them being misused. So I guess my first message in this video is, hey, if you use trigger warnings in content that you make, if you provide content warnings in whatever the heck you create, cool, thank you, you're doing great. But please say what the warning is for, because otherwise it's not helpful. So something that I'm sure you've seen and something that I've seen dozens of times is people that are generally right-wing or just people that are, big anti-SJW snowflakes, for lack of a better word. They'll say, well, trigger warnings are counterproductive and we shouldn't use them Because, for example, people oftentimes bring up the topic of college, right? People say, well, if there's going to be like a discussion or a speaker and they provide a trigger warning, then it's going to close down that conversation. It's going to make it so that people who are sensitive to those topics don't go to that conversation and don't participate, which means there will be less voices and it's kind of a silencing of free speech thing. Or people will say that talking about trauma is the best way to deal with it, which A, isn't true for everybody, and B, even if it was, you shouldn't force people into that situation. Anyways, the main argument of these people is that trigger warnings silence conversations, and they make it so that, sensitive people can avoid conversations that are important to have. However, that is often very misguided, because just because there's a trigger warning doesn't mean somebody is going to avoid a discussion that is potentially triggering to them. At the end of the day, providing a content warning doesn't hurt anybody. It takes like 15 seconds of time in your video, if that. It takes 1 or 2 lines on a page if you're writing a book. It's a sentence or even a sentence fragment if you're giving a presentation, right? If that minuscule amount of time or space in a book is more important to you than the mental health and the well-being and the safety and the happiness and the comfort of the people that are consuming your content, then I don't know what to tell you. But I believe this argument also comes out of a misunderstanding of how people actually use trigger warnings. So to give a bit of like perspective as somebody who has been through trauma, has struggled with an eating disorder, has self-harmed, has had suicidal ideation, those things oftentimes I need trigger warnings for. Not because I'll avoid any content that mentions them, but simply because I want to know ahead of time. A content warning doesn't mean I'm not going to engage with the work. It just means that I'm going to engage with it in possibly a different way than others. For example, if I had to read an article for a class and my professor gave a trigger warning for it for sexual assault, it's not that I wouldn't read the article. It's just that it would give me a chance to know that I'm in the right headspace to read something like that. It would allow me to, read it with a friend that's also in the class. If, I think I'll need a support network, it allows me to make sure that I'm in the right headspace before I go into something that could be potentially triggering. In that situation, the trigger warning isn't, making me avoid the content. It's helping me engage with it in a way that's safer for me and still completely engaging with the content, reading the work, watching the speech. And from a lot of the people I've talked to that use trigger warnings, they use it in a very similar way. For example, I discuss various mental health issues on this channel, right? This being one of them, I suppose. And, sometimes I'll have to start a video with hey, just gonna let you know beforehand that I'm going to be talking about disordered eating. That way people that may be triggered by it can have a heads up. They can pause the video, they can maybe go grab an apple for a comfort snack, they can watch it with a friend, be more comfortable, they can pause it and come back later when they're in a better headspace. Giving trigger warnings lets people engage with content in ways that is more comfortable for them, safer for them, better for their mental health. And if you don't like that, because it takes 3 seconds of your time, then you're just an asshole. Trigger warnings are not meant to, silence the person that's putting out information. They're meant to give people an introduction to something that they'll be watching. They let people determine for themselves whether or not they're in the right place to consume that content right now. I think what's especially important about them is that they let people not be caught off guard, right? So let's say I'm watching a video about tattoos. Let's say someone's giving a tattoo tour and they have a bunch of self-harm scars all over their side and they have a few tattoos there that they want to show anyway. That's totally fine. People are allowed to do that. Your body's allowed to exist. But oftentimes when people are going to show their scars, they will give you a trigger warning or they'll give you some sort of heads up, right? That's so that when you're watching, you aren't caught off guard and suddenly triggered when you weren't ready for it. You have the chance to pause. You have the chance to analyze your own mental health and think, okay, can I see this today? Am I okay? Can I watch this? And will I be unaffected by it, right? It allows you to analyze that content for yourself and make sure that you're okay with seeing it before you even see it. It's similar to any other type of warning sign, right? Let's say you're going to the mall and you come down a street and it's workers ahead, watch out. That's a warning, not a trigger warning, but it's a warning sign. That doesn't mean you're going to turn around and go back to your house. You're probably still going to go wherever you were trying to go. You might just take a different route. Make sure you're going slow enough that you can watch out for workers. Switch lanes so you can watch out for workers. Trigger warnings work in the same way. They allow you to still get to the end point and engage with the material, but in a way that's safer for you. And I also think people are kind of missing the point in that, like, okay, so there's a trigger warning for disordered eating, and it makes someone click off the video and they're like, I can't watch this right now, and I might not come back to this video, right? Nobody's ever under any obligation to consume any sort of content. Like, nobody is ever required to go watch a speech on their campus. At the end of the day, if a trigger warning does put somebody off a piece of content, if they don't watch it, if they don't read it, if they don't consume it, so what? Why does that impact you? I really do try when I'm discussing anything with people to put myself in their shoes and understand where they're coming from. But when it comes to like people dissing trigger warnings, I genuinely struggle to understand that, because like I can't teach you to care about other people and to care about yourself, right? Warnings exist all over the place in life. When you go to the doctor's office, right? They're not gonna sit you down in the chair and then stab you. They're gonna be like, hey, we're gonna give you an immunization for this, or we're gonna take your blood for this. They're not just gonna stab you. People oftentimes complain about like, oh, trigger warnings don't exist in real life. You gotta learn to not be so sensitive, but like they do. You got a construction sign on the side of the road. What's that to do? It's to help you engage with the world in a safer way. The exact same thing that trigger warnings do. They help you engage with the world in a safer way. When I see a trigger warning for something that I know will trigger me, that doesn't mean I'm going to immediately like, oh, well, guess I won't go to that lecture. Guess I'm skipping that class. It means I'll go to that class with like a sugary snack to like keep myself somewhat distracted but still engaged with the lecture. It means maybe I'll sit next to someone that I know or make plans with my friends for right after to distract me. It means that I will probably still go to the class, but I'll be prepared for what we're talking about. I'll know my boundaries. I will be able to set limits for myself and engage with the class in a healthier way. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to go to class. I suppose I can't really go through this video without at least touching on how the word triggered has kind of become like, I don't know how to phrase it. I don't want to say lost its meaning, because in spaces and in communities where mental health is like something that is discussed and respected, it's still oftentimes used the same way. But online, you can barely turn a corner. I guess that's a bad metaphor for the internet, but you can barely refresh your webpage without seeing someone make a joke about getting triggered, or equate someone being triggered to anger. It's extra frustrating for me as someone that's interested in psychology. Explaining things as triggers is extremely helpful when I'm talking to my therapist or my psychiatrist, or when I'm talking to someone that I'm talking about psychology with, right? Saying something is triggering for me is a really helpful way of expressing, hey, this is a certain thing that triggers my OCD, or this is a certain thing that can trigger my anxiety. It's especially a very common word when you discuss PTSD or any sort of traumatic experiences. Trauma doesn't always manifest itself through PTSD. Various different mental health conditions can be resultant of trauma. That doesn't mean they're any less valid or any less important to treat. But my point is, within psychology, within wider discussions about mental health, triggering, being triggered, something being a trigger is a really helpful way of expressing a concept. And the internet and meme culture in a way has kind of become a bastardization of that. My friends for the most part use the word triggered in the way that it's meant to be, but oftentimes I'll be with an acquaintance and they'll make a joke about being triggered, and I just I never know how to respond to it, I just want people to understand that the way that being triggered is used in pop culture now is such a misunderstanding of the way that it was originally used and the way that it's still helpful within psychology. It makes it harder for people with certain mental health conditions to express the way that they feel, because oftentimes for me, when I discuss oh, this thing triggered this sort of mental health thing in me, I can't help but associate that word with memes surrounding it, and it's gross. But honestly, as someone who uses trigger warnings, provides trigger warnings, when people make jokes about it, it feels like a huge misunderstanding, and people genuinely don't know where that word comes from, what it means, how it's genuinely helpful to people. And it bothers me, not because people making jokes about triggers triggers me, but because as someone it genuinely has triggers and genuinely has things that sets off my mental health in ways that I wish it wouldn't go, the use of it as a pop culture term, it diminishes the ways that it is used in a serious sense. And I feel like this happens with psychology a lot, where terms that mean one thing are taken within pop culture and then completely twisted and people don't understand it anymore. And then, you get into psychology and you're like, oh, why did I learn this about this thing? That has nothing to do with it. But like, that's a pretty common thing, I feel like, among words related to psychology. But I think, being triggered and the way that people treat that word is a great example. Oh, and I bet someone's gonna come in the comments with their hot take about how words can have different meanings, and like, they absolutely can. I don't disagree with you at all on that front. But when a word like triggered has two definitions that one of them devalues the other and makes the other definition less important and less impactful, then there's an issue. Trigger warnings are not something that were invented for sensitive snowflake liberals. Like, I don't care if that's what you think, you're wrong, and you're being blatantly ignorant and frankly just kind of rude. Trigger warnings are important for people that are learning to regulate their own mental health. They're important for people that are recovering from different mental health conditions. They're important for people recovering from substance abuse. They're important for people with PTSD. They're important for all sorts of people. And hell, they're important when you want to take your kid to see a racy movie, but you don't know exactly why it's racy, and if it's just because they say the shit word, then it's fine, you'll take them, but you don't want to take them if they're sexual assault, It's important to have trigger warnings because they help people in so many different ways, and you can't categorize that as like a sensitive snowflake not wanting to watch something because they say the fuck word in it. Like, that's not what they're for. Another kind of weird complaint that I've seen before is that like a trigger warning or a content warning will like ruin the book or ruin the like speech or presentation. But honestly, if that's true, then I just think it's badly written or badly produced. Books have synopsises. Reading a synopsis isn't going to spoil the book. Generally, when you go to a lecture, you know the general topic. If they tack on, hey, we're going to be discussing sexual assault, just be prepared for that, that's not going to ruin the lecture. If your book is spoiled by putting one extra line that warns the reader about a sensitive topic, then your writing is boring. If it all centralizes around that one sensitive topic, like, you did a bad job writing, I'm sorry. If your story is so one-dimensional that it only takes like the vague mentioning of one topic to spoil your work, then like you just didn't create something that is necessarily worthwhile, to me at least, and I know that's like objective, but now circling back a bit to the first thing that I talked about on how people are oftentimes using trigger warnings wrong, like presenting them in the wrong way, I want to talk a bit about a study that was done that claimed to prove that trigger warnings don't work, and that in fact they may induce anxiety where there shouldn't be any. But let me talk a bit about the design of these studies, and I'm going to link an article in the description that talks about it as well, but they frame it in a way that they agree with the study, which is interesting to me, but I'll link the article about it. But in the study, people were presented with an article that they read, right? And they had different groups and stuff, but I want to point out that the group with the trigger warning got the warning, I will read this like verbatim, trigger warning in all caps. The passage you are about to read contains disturbing content and may trigger an anxiety response, especially in those who have a history of trauma. That is way too vague to be effective. I would read that and be like, well, okay, that could mean literally anything. It's hard to do a study like that because trigger warnings are so varied and can oftentimes be very specific. I went to an event the day before Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience where a Black trans poet did, their poetry. And it was incredible and I'm so glad I went. But they started it off with, hey, just so you guys know, I'm going to be talking about transphobic violence. I'm going to be talking about family disturbances. They gave us, the audience, a warning for the things that they were going to be talking about. And that was good and helpful because nobody left, I don't think. But for me, that let me know what I was getting into. I was like, okay, I'm prepared to hear about these things tonight. Like, this is important for me right now. And I'm comfortable hearing those things. It was a good warning. It made me a lot more comfortable with the presentation. They didn't stand up there and go, trigger warning. The content you are about to, that's not how it's helpful. It doesn't need to be that formal. The sentence doesn't need to look like that. Unless it's obvious in the title of a paper per se that it's going to be discussing eating disorders, putting a little note. This essay will discuss body image and eating disorders. That's not going to spoil the article, but it's not trigger warning. The piece you are about to read may contain disturbing content, because disturbing content is too vague to actually help anyone. And yes, it could induce anxiety because people aren't going to know what that means. They're going to be like looking out for it. They're going to be anxious. Phrasing it like that, saying disturbing content could trigger an anxious response, that's not going to help anybody that reads that. The way that they used a trigger warning in the study where they were trying to prove whether or not they're effective was an ineffective trigger warning because it wasn't specific enough. It's not going to help anyone. If I were to read that, I wouldn't know whether or not I was comfortable reading the article. I wouldn't know whether or not I was in the right headspace for it because it doesn't tell me what the article's about. That's not how you use a trigger warning. The point is not to say, this is going to be sensitive content. That's not going to help anybody. There was also a psychologist quoted in the article who claimed that trigger warnings are a form of, let me get this right, cognitive avoidance is really counterproductive, which is fair. But however, again, I would like to point out that trigger warnings don't necessarily mean cognitive avoidance. They just mean someone like me being ready for the material that they're about to consume. It means engaging in it in a safer way. It means assessing your own headspace and knowing what you're comfortable with. And those things are not mentally unhealthy. That's not cognitive avoidance. That's not always how trigger warnings are used. And I also want to emphasize that I don't believe anybody should ever be forced to recount their trauma, to read things that trigger them. As someone who wants to be a gender therapist someday, the last thing I want to do is have a client come in and say, hey, I have like childhood trauma that I maybe want to work on. I'm not going to immediately force them to recount that. You know, I've been through some trauma-related therapy, and the last thing my therapist ever would have done is force me to do trauma work if I believe it's making me too uncomfortable at the moment. Like, that's not how therapy should work in my mind. Maybe it's because I'm, you know, more along like a humanist person, but you shouldn't ever force someone to confront their trauma. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why you would ever think that's a good idea. So in this article that I read, another psychologist said the solution should be, rather than issuing trigger warnings, universities can best serve students by facilitating access to effective and proven treatments for PTSD and other mental health problems. Let me counter that. Why not both? Yes, universities and every like public facility, workplaces, I don't care, schools, they should absolutely be pushing better mental health. They should absolutely be saying, hey, there's this program if you want to, you know, step up your mental health. Therapy should be provided to everybody that wants it and needs it. But that doesn't mean that trigger warnings are useless. It's like improv. You can't just say no more trigger warnings, instead you're going to therapy. You should say yes trigger warnings because they're helpful in a variety of ways, and it doesn't always mean people are avoiding the content. And also therapy. You know, I've seen so many hot takes based on that one study and basically saying, oh, trigger warnings are useless because this one study says so. But that study doesn't properly use trigger warnings. That's not how you write one. You can't just say, hey, sensitive content might make you anxious. People that get anxious over specific sensitive content generally know that. And generally we know for ourselves what our boundaries are, how we're feeling in the moment, whether or not we can read something at that specific time. And we're not being helped by a giant sentence that says trigger warning, sensitive content. That's not what a trigger warning should be. Yes, an important part of recovering from many mental health conditions is confronting it and talking to a therapist or a psychiatrist about it and discussing ways that you can confront the thing that gives you anxiety, the thing that triggers you. But being thrown into that situation outside of a therapy context before you're ready for it, before you've talked to a therapist about it, that isn't helpful. If you don't have that support network of a therapist, right? If you don't have those tools on you, then like, it's not going to help. Okay, I have stitched my last stitch, and I just want you to know that I cut out like the absolute perfect amount of string to sew on this patch. So I'm very proud of myself. But yeah, those are my thoughts on trigger warnings and some controversial things surrounding them, I suppose. Where the heck did my needle go? I sewed on this boy. I really need to do the cure patch because it's like starting to fray and stuff, but also that's like a look, so I kind of don't want to. But yeah, this bat is now sewn on. And with that said, I'm gonna pack some more because I leave in 14 hours. So let me know your thoughts on trigger warnings, especially if they are something that help you out. I don't think they're like a detriment to anybody, but let me know if that's the case for you as well. It's like a big pet peeve of mine when people use the word triggered in the wrong way and just write out trigger warnings that aren't helpful in the way that they need to be. It's a good thing to talk about, I think, especially in the realm of mental health and psychology. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Goodbye. I hope that you are in a good space mentally and know how to regulate your own environment and feel as comfortable as you possibly can. And I will talk to you later, maybe.